Alright, just like for my engineer, I like swapping around builds on my Necromancer based on what open world challenges I'm tackling. When I'm just running around, doing achievements or farming rifts, I like what Reaper brings to the table. But when I want to solo champions, then nothing beats Harbinger's damage combined with its insane ability to regenerate whatever damage it's taken in mere seconds. And whenever I'm doing meta events, well, that's when I like Scourge's support abilities and ranged AoE. Now, I know that swapping builds is easy, but I also know that not everyone who will come across this video will have legendary gear, and that swapping stats might be a bit more difficult. So just like in my previous guide, I'll be recommending multiple sets of gear. The first will always be a set that is optimal in group content as well, so that if you eventually want to tackle fractals, raids or strikes, all you'll have to do is swap some traits around and you'll be good to go. But I'll also recommend a couple of alternatives for anyone who wants to exclusively stick to the open world, or for any of you who just like experimenting with different setups. Okay, so I mentioned Reaper being my generalist build, and that's because it offers almost everything you could ever want for just about anything in the open world, as they have incredible burst damage, Death Shroud, which literally gives them a second health bar, but also some really great crowd control and a way to maintain permanent quickness, fury and stability in combat. And that's before we even take NECRO's utilities into consideration, which can help patch any shortcoming their builds might have. But before we get to those, let's take a look at our traits first, as we'll be picking up Spite, Soul Reaping and of course the Reaper Elite spec. The Spite trait line will basically grant us might every time we enter Shroud, use Shroud 1 and whenever we hit an enemy below 50% HP. Now, there are a couple of choices for you to make within this trait line though, with the first being either Spiteful Talisman for a 10% damage increase, or Spiteful Renewal if you need some extra condition cleanse. The other choice pertains to the final trait, where you can opt for yet another 20% damage increase whenever your enemies are below 50% HP, or Dread to grant yourself quickness and fury every time you fear a foe, while also recharging your Shroud skill tree, which coincidentally can be used to inflict fear. Generally, I would say it's fine to stick with Close to Death as there's other ways of maintaining quickness, but if you know you won't be using Jadebot protocols, it is definitely worth considering Dread, especially for longer fights, as you might be dropping quickness once you spend some time out of your Shroud. Then we have the Soul Reaping trait line, which is all about improving your Shroud uptime by increasing your maximum life force and the amounts you receive. And our major traits will further improve our damage, while also letting us stack massive amounts of vulnerability and improve both our critical hit chance and damage. Now there are a couple of traits you could swap around here as well, like Unyielding Blast for Speed of Shadows if you're struggling with getting crippled, but if that's the case, I'd probably recommend changing some of the utilities instead. And if you want to become even tankier, then Eternal Life could be worth considering. But since we have so many other forms of damage mitigation, I would actually say that the critical bonuses from Death Perception are just too good to pass up on. And that brings me to the Reaper Elite spec, which turns our Death Shroud into Reaper Shroud and will grant us insane amounts of damage reduction, which will get even better thanks to Soul Eater's damage increase and self-healing, and with Reaper's Onslaught we'll be able to permanently get quickness as long as we're in Shroud and harder hitting crits. We'll also pick up Chilling Nova along the way, which will cause an explosion every time we land a critical hit on a chilled foe. And our minor traits will actually make those chills last longer and grant us yet another damage bonus. Now, the amount of damage bonuses we can accrue from these traits is actually really impressive, because we have that 10% from Spiteful Talisman and the 20% below 50 from Close to Death from Spite. But then we also have the 10% when entering and exiting Shrouds from Soul Barbs in Soul Reaping, and another 10% from the Reaper Soul Eater trait, on top of that 15% from Cold Shoulder. And that's before we take into consideration that vulnerability, which we're gonna inflict with our Shroud 1, will grant us another 1% per stack up to a maximum of 25. Now when it comes to gear, I recommend getting Berserker stats with an Assassin's Helmet, Runes of the Dragon Hunter and a Relic of the Fireworks, as this will be the exact setup that you'll also be able to bring to group content. If you would like some extra defense in the open world, then you could consider Marauder's gear for some extra vitality, or Demolishers for some extra toughness, without necessarily giving up too much on power, precision and ferocity. But honestly, this is one of those builds that doesn't really need the extra defense from gear. As for your weapons, most group content builds will recommend you either combine a greatsword with a dagger and sword, or with a spear, all with sigils of force and accuracy. But in the open world, you could just as well change that second set to a staff for some easy range tagging, while still having a great way to quickly regenerate some of your life force. And you could even swap out those sigils of accuracy for impact if all you're doing is fighting regular and veteran enemies. But I would only recommend doing this if you're sure you won't bring this exact set to raids and strikes. Now, if you do want an open world specific set, then there's also a couple of relics you should consider instead of fireworks, like Midnight King if you're not taking Dread and you need extra fury, or maybe even Cavalier if you want a mini version version of the Jadebot protocols. And since our elite will be on a 30-second cooldown, it might even be worth playing around with some of those that activate when you use that ability, like Ceres for some extra damage and boon corruption, Wizard's Tower if you want to pull in enemies while reflecting projectiles, or even the Pack if you want to grant yourself some extra super speed, might and fury that way. And that brings me to the actual abilities, which will of course change depending on the weapons you pick up, so I won't be going over every single one of them. But I will talk about a key concept that is really important for every single profession, and that's ever so important for Reapers as well, as their Shroud 4 deals incredible amounts of damage while generating a ton of projectiles. So every time you use that ability, you're gonna want to do that inside of a combo field. And ideally, it's gonna be a dark field, which you can generate with Greatsword 4, as well as both the Wells of Suffering and Darkness. Now when you enter Shroud, also make sure that you hit that third ability once for some extra stability and a 66% damage reduction for 6 seconds. And if you're running Dread, you might as well use it once more for the Fear, Quickness, and to get the ability on cooldown, as its recharge will get cut in half for every single enemy you kill. And while these will be your bread and butter combo, it is worth learning about Executioner Strike, which deals damage, crowd control, and will leave an ice field behind, because you can combo that field with Shroud's 2 Discharge to grant yourself a Frost Aura for another 10% damage reduction. Now, I've already mentioned the Wells of Darkness and Suffering, and for your basic setup, I would recommend getting your Soul is Mine as your heal and Chill to the Bone as your elite for some extra stability, fury, swiftness, and quickness, on top of the damage and crowd control it will deal. And lastly, you can round out your utilities with You Are All Weaklings for even more damage, might, and a much needed stun break. These 5 abilities should serve you quite well in just about any situation, but if you notice you're struggling with conditions being inflicted on you, then you could always swap out your heal for Consume Conditions. Or if you'd rather get some passive healing, then the Signet of Vampirism could be a worthy replacement as well. And the same goes for your elite, which you can swap with a Flesh Golem, which will arguably grant you less boons, but can be an extra target for enemies and still has some tremendous CC capabilities. I would always recommend you keep both of the wells though, but the Shout can always be replaced by another skill, like Spectral Grasp if you don't want to chase down your enemies or you want extra CC against a larger target, or Spectral Armor if you need some extra protection, or maybe even Signet of Spite if you just want a passive option. Now, power won't be the only stat combo that works great on Reaper though, as they can lean into those chills even more by having them inflict massive amounts of bleeding as well. To do this, we'll keep the Spite trait line, but we're gonna swap the damage boost from Spiteful Talisman and Close to Death to Bitter Chill, so that we can inflict vulnerability every single time we chill our target. And this time around, we do want to make sure we pick up Dread for the permanent Quickness and Fury, which will also allow us to recharge Shroud 3 much faster. We're also gonna drop Awaken the Pain, because while the extra might could be nice, this trait actually reduces the amount of condition damage we would get from this boon. So we're gonna opt for Chill of Death to inflict even more chill and to get access to a boon strip. Now, since this is a condition build, we'll swap out Soul Reaping for Curses, so that we get a chance to inflict bleeding every time we land a crit, and boost these even further based on how many conditions our enemies have, while also increasing our condition damage itself. As for the major traits, you actually get to choose which you pick for the first one, as Insidious Disruption will inflict torment whenever you disable an enemy, and Chilling Darkness will chill when you inflict blind. And if you're struggling with conditions, well then Plague Sending should cover those for you. Personally, I usually go with Chilling Darkness, but again, all 3 will do just fine. And as for the other 2 traits, I would recommend Parasitic Contagion so that you get some extra healing outside of Shroud, and Devouring Darkness for an overall boost to your condition damage. Which brings me back to the Reaper, where we'll stick with Chilling Nova, because chills will now also inflict bleeding thanks to the Deathly Chill trait. And since this whole build is based around these 2 conditions, we're gonna end with Chilling Victory, so that every time we do strike a chilled foe, we also get some extra might and life force. As for the gear, you're of course gonna want some more condition damage, but you're also gonna have to make a choice if you want a set that you can also bring to group content. Typically, if you'd like to bring a Condi Reaper to Fractal Strikes or Raids, you will want a Grieving set with Runes of the Crate. But if you prefer playing a Scourge or a Harbinger, then Vipers with Runes of the Trapper would be more appropriate. And if you'd rather cover a Boon DPS role, well then an Alacrity Scourge would actually bring Ritualist gear with Trapper Runes, and a Quickness Harbinger would ideally bring a Viper set with Tormenting Runes. So there's not one single set that will work for all condition damage builds, which is why I would recommend either starting with a Viper setup with Trapper Runes, which won't be ideal for a Quickness Harbinger, but could get you by and still allow you to cover both of the other condition builds as well, or the Ritualist set if you plan on playing an Alacrity Scourge. Typically, all of these would also bring a Relic of the Fractal to group content, but for the open world, I would highly recommend investing in a Relic of the Reaper, as it's gonna make this build even better by letting you inflict chill and therefore bleeding every single time you will use a Shout ability. And as for the utilities, you'll want anything that can either inflict chill, bleeding, or even blind if you're going with the Chilling Darkness trait. And of course shrouds if you're bringing the Relic of the Reaper. So keep that Well of Darkness and the Shroud from before, as well as your heal and elite shrouds, but change your Well of Suffering with Suffer. And when it comes to the weapon sets, you do have a few options. If you want some extra mobility, then dual swords will work pretty great. But if you want to focus on damage, then you might want to swap out your main hand sword for a pistol. And also don't underestimate just how good staff works with this build either, because it has a mark that will inflict bleeding on a very short cooldown, and 2 others that will inflict chill, with one of them fearing as well. Now, I haven't talked about Celestial gear just yet, and that's because the Reaper honestly doesn't need it thanks to all of the survivability baked into its kit. But if you don't mind grabbing such a set, which is actually not that expensive anymore thanks to the World v World vendor they added some time ago, you could build a near immortal Harbinger that will deal incredible amounts of damage. And for that build, we're actually gonna mix and match the trait lines we've already discussed. So we're gonna stick with curses for plague sending so that we can consistently transfer conditions, parasitic contagion for next level sustain, and since our goal is to fight champions, we're gonna keep the damage boost from lingering curse. But instead of the spy trait line, we're gonna grab soul reaping this time around so that we can inflict vulnerability with Shroud 1 and get that 10% damage increase from soul barbs. But instead of death perception, we're gonna go with Doomfire this time around, so that our Shroud 1 now also will inflict burning. Which already brings us to the Harbinger, who gets a special version of Shroud that will not protect their HP, and a new debuff called Blight, which is gonna empower some of their attacks, but will lower their maximum HP the higher the stacks get. And this might sound bad at first, but once you take Alchemic Vigor into consideration, then you will quickly see that having more stacks means getting healed every single second, which when combined with Parasitic Contagion means that you'll almost never be low on HP. As for the major traits, you're gonna want Septic Corruption for the increased condition damage based on your Blight stacks and the extra poison for Shroud 2. And you'll also want Deathly Haste for the permanent quickness. The middle trait can be once more swapped around. Typically, I would recommend Dark Gunslinger for the extra damage, but if you sorely lack stability, then Implacable Foe can get you some, despite this build not really benefiting from ferocity all that much. And if you just want some extra boon duration, well then Twisted Medicine isn't that bad either. Now, I've already mentioned that this is a Celestial build, but if you'd rather have a set that you can also bring to group content, then it's fine to stick to the Viper set with Trapper Runes that I recommended earlier. And this time around you're gonna want to grab a Pistol and Scepter with a dagger in your offhand with Runes of Torment and Bursting. The dagger is gonna allow you to transfer conditions through Deadly Swarm, and should ideally be used every time you use Blood's Power, which is gonna grant you an incredible amount of might and inflict 4 stacks of bleeding on your target, but also 2 on yourself. Now, Blood's Power has 2 charges though, but that second set of stacks that you will inflict on yourself can also be transferred off you by going to Shroud thanks to Plague Sending, so it's fine to use the ability a second time even if your Dagger 4 is off cooldown. All of the other utilities should ideally be elixirs, as they're gonna help you stack Blight real fast and will further grant you some much needed boons while also inflicting even more conditions on your enemy. The playstyle of itself is very straightforward, as you can use all of your pistol abilities off cooldown, but don't underestimate just how good the Scepter can be either, as it has plenty of bleeding, a boon strip, and its attacks don't count as projectiles despite it being a ranged weapon. So whenever you fight an enemy with projectile reflect, just swap weapons and you can keep attacking. Now, the Harbinger Shroud also has a couple of new mechanics you need to be aware of, because both Shroud 3 and 4 can be empowered by consuming some of your Blight stacks, and Shroud 5 is a massive CC that will restore some of your life force, so feel free to use that on cooldown. And as already mentioned, if you need to quickly regenerate some of your HP, don't use any ability that uses up your Blight and you should be topped up in no time. And that covers most of it, except for the relics, for which you can just bring the Relic of the Fractal, which is also the best in slot 1 for group content, but if you'd rather have some alternatives, then Akeem can offer some extra AoE, or if you'd rather have some extra stability without sacrificing Dark Gunslinger, then the Relic of the Centaur will grant you just that every single time you use your heal ability. Or you could even bring some of the newer ones, like the Relic of the Blightbringer, which should be primed to trigger every time you use your Pistol 3 ability. Now, both specs are honestly so good that any of the 3 builds I already talked about should do fine no matter what type of content you'll be tackling in the open world. But if you would like to add one more to the mix, then Scourge can work great both solo and during meta events where it can bring some extra party support. In the past, whenever I played a Scourge, I would often bring Blood Magic with Transfusion so that I could pull down players to me and rest them during harder meta events. But since ANET nerfed the trait, I now prefer going for more damage and supporting the people around me with some extra barrier, might and condition cleanses. The trait lines for this build will actually be very similar to the Harbinger build, as we'll keep curses with Parasitic Contagion for the self-heal and Lingering Curse for the extra condition damage and life force regen. but instead of Plague Sending, I would recommend getting Insidious Disruption and focusing on damage, as we're gonna have other ways of dealing with conditions. And nothing really changes to the Soul Reaping trait line either, as the bonus damage from Soul Barbs is just too good to give up, and being able to inflict vulnerability consistently will not only help ourselves, but literally everyone around us attacking our targets. And we're actually also gonna keep Doomfire, because Scourges can improve burning damage by 10% with the Fell Beacon trait, and we're gonna add Sadistic Searing so that we can inflict even more burning with our F2 ability, and Demonic Lore so that every single time we inflict Torment, we add yet another stack of burning. Now, if all you're doing is meta events, you could actually forego some of your own damage in favor of party support by getting Abrasive Grit, so that you can grant allies around you more might and even cleanse some of their conditions. And you could also take Sandstorm Shrouds for even more barrier and protection. Technically, you could also go for Desert Empowerment to grant everyone around you Alacrity, but I'm personally less of a fan of this trait whenever I'm playing solo, and I don't really like to swap traits around every time I'm about to do a meta event. Now, you probably already know this by now, but Scourges trade in their Death Charge for the ability to summon shades every few seconds, and as long as they have one active, they get some extra concentration, which will help with boon duration, extra expertise, which will help with condition duration, and even a good amount of damage reduction. So while they might not have that second health bar Reapers have, they will still end up being fairly tanky, especially since their F3 ability will always grant barrier regardless of which trade setup they go for. And I personally like bringing Sandflare as my heal so that I get even more barrier while also inflicting torment and corrupting boons on nearby enemies. As for the other utilities, I usually take Trail of Anguish for the stun break and stability, while getting yet another way of inflicting both torment and burning and being able to corrupt even more boons. And speaking of the latter, Desiccate will corrupt even more of them, while also providing you with a good amount of might and fury, as well as some life force for your shade abilities. Lastly, I've really come to enjoy bringing Spectral Grasp, both so I can pull in nearby enemies, as well as to quickly deal with break bars by standing inside the boss's hitbox, as every single hand that you will shoot out will count as a different CC. And as for the elite, the most popular recommendation would be to bring Plague Lance, as it's really hard to beat the amount of conditions it can inflict. But again, in the open world, I actually appreciate the shorter cooldown, as well as the extra might from Ghastly Breach, while still being able to inflict a good amount of torment and burning, and having access to yet another boon corrupt, which admittedly might be overkill at this point, unless you're maybe fighting those annoying champions in Jantir. As for the gear, nothing really changes from the previous recommendations. If this is your first set, then Vipers with Trapper Runes will probably be ideal, so that you can play either a Condition Harbinger or Scourge in group content by swapping some traits around, or honestly even a Quickness Harbinger, even though they would typically take different runes. But if you'd prefer some extra survivability, then a Ritualist set would give you just that, and it can double for an Alacrity Scourge build later on. Now this time around, I would actually recommend sticking to a Scepter and Pistol in your main hand and a Torch in your off hand. I've already discussed both of the main hand weapons, so I won't go over them again, but the Torch is gonna add a good amount of life force generation, burning, torment, might, and even more crowd control to your toolkit. And the usual relics such as Fractal or Rakim are unsurprisingly some of the ones that work the best with this build as well. Although you could consider bringing some Wells combined with the relic of the Chronomancer if you would also like to get permanent quickness. And that relic can also come in handy for any of the builds I already talked about if all you want to do is gathering, as it's gonna guarantee you'll have permanent quickness even outside of combat, and if there's any enemies nearby, your wells will probably take care of them by the time you're done gathering. And that's about it. There's actually so many other fun Necromancer builds out there, and I might eventually share a couple more, like the auto-attack Minion Mancer that I previously used on my stream to solo all of the Heart of Thorns champions and even some Path of Fire bounties, or the Infinite Shroud Reaper. But I do feel like these four are a great baseline for you to get started with, and should even later on help you transition to group content without having to relearn everything from scratch. Now, if you'd rather play something else, then go check out my open world engineer guide, or let me know which profession you want me to cover next.